Welcome to the 26th Annual Writer Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Dean Nelson. I'm the journalism faculty at the university. And one aspect of writing that is so crucial in the university environment is academic writing, or writing that is based on a faculty member's research and expertise. How does this kind of writing differ from the more popular genres of fiction, poetry, or others? Why does it matter? And why should students consider this kind of writing? We've collected a number of Point Loma faculty colleagues to discuss this topic, led by our own esteemed Hadley Wood, a professor emerita from Point Loma Nazarene University. In part one, we discuss this topic with Alain Lescart, Bettina Tate Pedersen, Lyons-Pardue, Max Butterfield, and Karl Martin.
Welcome to the Writer Symposium by the Sea and to an interview about research and writing with some of Point Loma Nazarene University's very active researchers. I'm Hadley Wood, a retired professor of French, and I'd like to welcome our participants. Bettina Pedersen, a professor of literature, Karl Martin, also a professor of literature, Lyons-Pardue, professor of religion, Max Butterfield, professor in psychology, and Alain Lescart, professor of French, and PLNU's own Kramer, or at least Kramer lookalike. Okay, so where I want to start is just briefly, and I'll start with you, Bettina. What was the title of your dissertation?
Oh my goodness, that was a long time ago, Hadley. It had something to do with the regional women writers of the post-Confederation period, examining constructions of ideal womanhood and national identity in the post-Confederation period. A mouthful.
Great. And Karl?
Flannery O'Connor's Prophetic Imagination.
Wonderful. And Kara?
Oh, I was hoping I had more time on this one. It changed when it became a book. It's about the long ending of Mark and Mary Magdalene's role.
Okay. Max?
Isn't this interesting? I have no idea. At one time, it consumed my life.
Dangerous Dog?
Yeah, something about dangerous dog or dastardly dude, anthropomorphism, ... That was the important part. The ... I have no idea. If you have it, I don't know.
Yes, I do. Anthropomorphism, threat, and willingness to approach non-human targets.
That sounds very familiar.
Alain, how about you?
Splendeur et misère de la grisette, évolution d'une figure emblématique, splendor and misery of the grisette, evolution of an emblematic figure in France. So grisette is a seamstress, poor seamstress that has been abused in a lot of different ways.
Yes, for those of you who don't speak French, the French word for gray is gris, masculine, and grise, feminine, and the et, of course, is a diminutive. So a grisette is a little gray girl. And that was the name given to the many young women, often from the countryside, who came in during the Industrial Revolution to work in factories and were given as a uniform a little gray dress. You've seen it if you've seen The Miz. And they didn't earn a lot of money, so they were easy prey for men who might offer a little bit of extra help in exchange. And therefore, grisette became a synonym for kind of loose woman and whatever. So what's interesting about many of these thesis titles is that they're clearly intersections in order to be able to narrow and go deep. Well, in order to go deep, you have to narrow. You go to a place, for example, Bettina, where women's issues, Canadian issue, 19th century sense of self and nationality, all of those things meet. What's fascinating about that, though, is that then gave you several directions in which to continue your research. So how many of those directions have you actually followed?
Well, it might be safe to say all of them. I have presented papers on Canadian women writers. I continue to present papers and publish on women writers, mostly British women writers. Certainly, I look at the intersections of feminism and faith, which arises out of my continual reading, teaching, and researching of women writers, but also my own life. And I've published on teaching. So pretty much all of them. The focus on national identity was perhaps the most localized to my dissertation because I haven't had much opportunity to teach 19th century Canadian women writers across my teaching career. I've taught mostly British women writers and American women writers.
But nonetheless,
I continue
this
to be
work,
fascinated with Canadian writers and the whole post-colonial question. And I've taught a number of post-colonial writers and post-colonial literature in my teaching career. So I guess it would be safe to say all of them.
which is, I mean, to me, you have to wonder when the dissertation is done, where now? And in fact, your dissertation can allow you, okay, I've done this, I could just broaden it a little bit. I could do some more, I could broaden this. And Kara, you're a good example, I think, of how that works, particularly in terms of shifting audience. Could you talk a little about where you've gone from the dissertation and how you've used that as a launching pad?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, it's interesting to hear Bettina say that she's tracked down all of those, kind of trajectories leading outward. And I can relate, but also think, oh my goodness, I have so much more to cover. But I think none of us can really sustain the sort of scholarly work that it takes to do a dissertation without a deep interest and investment in the subject matter. And so for me, given audiences for my work are not merely scholarly, although I hope that other scholars read it, but working in biblical studies and New Testament studies and theology more broadly, I care enough about this and reading the Bible well that I want to make sure that audiences in local churches and pastors are influenced by it. And so, Hadley, I hope this is what you were asking about. I have often tried to interpret some of my findings in ways that will be accessible to a broader audience or to different levels of engagement. And so applying a sort of interest in women in biblical texts, often overlooked women or women about whom lots of assumptions are made. I think that has real teeth for addressing issues that are like very obviously prevalent in the church and for correcting a real need of attention and respect for our female foremothers in scripture. And so, yeah, I've tried to, at multiple levels, engage with that question.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Looking at Kara's resume, is that you'd see here's a topic and she presents it at a conference, at an academic conference. And then you see the same topic become an article. But then you see the same topic configured for adult Sunday school curriculum. And then you see it in a different, slightly different form for a devotional magazine. And when Kara and I talked about this, she said, well, this is kind of standard for my field. Now, Max, your field has a very different kind of format that often involves students. Can you talk about how you took your sort of thesis interest and then moved it into student work?
Sure, absolutely. So I have pretty much dropped the research work from my dissertation years ago. And the reason why isn't because I'm no longer interested in the topic. I think I have a pretty wide variety of interests, and that suits my sort of approach to research here at Point Loma really well. Because what I'm always trying to do is involve students. And so if they're not interested in an obscure topic like anthropomorphism, then I'm not going to push that on them. And I think some people do, and I think you can do that really well. I think you can do that really well at Point Loma. But for me, it worked better to figure out what students were interested in themselves, and then to put my professional spin kind of on top of that to really take their research to the next level. So that's always been my goal, is to connect with students by kind of meeting them where they are, and then putting on my, sort of professional hat and taking them where they need to go, whether it's grad school or preparing for jobs or, whatever it might be.
And you're obviously, what that research should look like in the confines of your particular discipline, but you also, as I looked at the poster presentations you had done, of which, you didn't send me all 100, I don't think, but a good sample of them. And it looked like what they all had in common was, or most of them, was a focus on how people make decisions, what factors influence people, or how much a particular factor influences. And then students made the selection of where they wanted to examine that, but that did seem to be the thread.
Yeah, and a lot of that is out of necessity. When you're a professor, whether you're at a major research institution or a teaching focused school like Point Loma, money is always scarce. So that's true, whether you're here or at UCSD or wherever, you could always use more money for your research activities. And one of the things I found that really worked well in our sort of limited budget was looking at perceptions and looking at decisions. So if I had a student, for example, who was interested in studying schizophrenia, many people who are going into psychology find that to be kind of a fascinating topic. We don't have the resources to be able to do that. We don't have a clinic on campus, or there's really no way for us to do that. But what we can do is investigate what people think about individuals with schizophrenia, or how people perceive individuals with schizophrenia.
Right.
And so part of that is, like I said, necessity. And then part of it is, that is actually where my deep-seated interest lies, is how we form our thoughts about other people, and sort of what that does to our social interactions and our understanding of our social world.
Right. Now, Karl, when it came to, you had a wonderful, I loved your title, Flannery O'Connor's Prophetic Imagination, which clearly gives you two paths, issues of prophetic imagination, and of course, Flannery O'Connor, on whom you've written extensively. But of particular interest to me is also how you took prophetic imagination and eventually combined it, or saw how it led to a particular lens through which to look at American culture. So how did that happen?
Yeah, by happenstance probably, but looking back, I think the consistent theme for me seems to be the question of what it means to be a Christian and an American simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think doing graduate work in the 1980s, where I saw a lot of Christians not negotiating that terribly well, frankly, and nationalism becoming too much a part of their understanding of their Christian faith, I think I was drawn to O'Connor initially because she seemed free of that. She seemed always to be placing her primary identification and allegiance to the church rather than to the nation state. And working with Walter Brueggemann's theology of the prophet in the Old Testament, gave me a way of thinking about that, and how a critique of American society from a Christian perspective could look when it wasn't overly tied to nationalistic concerns. So then I started looking for other voices in the culture that offered the same kind of critique, and found a whole host of what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci calls organic intellectuals, who had access to popular culture and who created popular culture texts that offered similar critiques from their social location. Sometimes explicitly Christian, sometimes not explicitly Christian, but still challenging the notion of what's typically called American exceptionalism, that the American nation state is somehow different from every other nation state that's ever existed.
Right. Not that Americans are the only one. The way the French say, the French way of doing things is the French exception.
Right. Well, and the Americans learned it from the British. British,
well, exactly.
British exceptionalism was in place long before they.
What I love, though, was the wonderful story of how you actually came upon this topic at all. Because as I remember, it came out of the recommendation of a friend that you read these Flannery O'Connor's short stories, and then you saw something that connected to a book on your shelf that you had not yet read.
Yeah, I had been part of a reading group with Dean Nelson before I went off to Minnesota to go to graduate school. And after I left, they picked up the book The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann and really enjoyed it. They recommended it to me. I had purchased it, but I had not read it. And I was on the advice of one of my fellow TAs in the composition program who knew of my interest in religion and literature. I was reading O'Connor's essays. And in one of her essays, O'Connor writes, "A writer's vision must be a prophetic vision." And I had this moment in my apartment, still so vivid in my memory, of just kind of setting that down and asking, I wonder if that has anything to do with Brueggemann's notion of the prophetic imagination. And Brueggemann opened up a way of thinking about O'Connor's work that was tremendously helpful. And I had the good fortune to have a dissertation advisor who let me use a theologian as a primary interpreter of a writer. So yeah.
Fabulous. But it also is such a wonderful story about how there's a moment of, aha, this is something that is exciting, that is worth talking about. And Alain, as I remember, you had that in a graduate class where somehow the grisette topic came up, and yes?
Well, it did. And it's more something that I discovered by myself. I came and begin to be admitted in a PhD program. You should already arrive with an idea of what you're going to do. If not, you are not accepted in a program. So my first idea was to work on La Dame aux Camélias, which is one of the most famous novels, the first very big drama, a play under the Second Empire under Louis Napoleon. And it's the story of a courtesan. And I say, well, I'm going to work on that because I really love there's a deep Christian message about redemption of women that are abused at that time. And as I begin my research, I realized there were so many books already written on that topic. It was, an enormous field already completely covered. But while I was reading and rereading La Dame aux Camélias, I discovered this very secondary character called the grisette, who had a very good ending in the book while the courtesan is dying from pneumonia. And I say,
they always.
Yeah, they always, yeah. I say, who is that grisette? And suddenly, as I begin to do my research, I just discover it was everywhere like salt and pepper on a meal from the 1825 to the 1850s. Every book written by the Romantic and post author had a grisette somewhere. So I become very interested, and I discover also that not many things have been written on her, because there was really diverse representation of her. So that's how I got involved in that. And as I was taking class, I took a class in British to connect with Bettina. I took a class on British literature with Professor Higonnet, a very famous professor at the University of Connecticut. And we read Villette from Charlotte Bronte. And I discover, because the action takes place in Belgium and there's a certain representation of women, that the main character was also associated with a grisette. And nobody had written anything or discovered that, because nobody paid attention to that. So it allowed me in that class to write a paper, and my professor Higonnet said, you need to publish in the Bronte Review, because that's really somebody that never touched, and it's really interesting. So yes, one thing leads to another one, and research sometimes open ways to other topics.
So how, that's the issue then I want to address. How do you find the openings? Now, Kara already, we talked about that there are specific devotional magazines or, Wesleyan educational curriculum. But how do you find the places where you can begin to share your ideas? You go online, what do you look for? Bettina, because I know you are actively involved.
Well, there are a number of ways, and I always feel that probably other scholars do this better than I do, because it's kind of a messy process. But I keep folders, electronic folders of calls for papers that come into my inbox because of connection with discussion lists in Victorian studies or the like. And I just read those when they come in. And if they seem somehow relevant to something I'm teaching, or maybe something I have presented at a conference previously, or there were times when I was thinking about what have I written in my dissertation that might be suitable for a conference. I try to match something in this sort of intersectional field of interests that I have to the specific calls for papers. And it's always a matter of kind of tweaking topics, excluding or including different angles of research, or perhaps different primary texts of research. But once I find something that I think can connect, a conference that can connect, or a call for papers for a book, or an edited collection that can connect, then I'll submit a conference proposal or a proposal for the special issue in the journal, see if it's accepted. If it's accepted and it's a conference, I'll go present in the conference. Sometimes those conference papers then in turn become articles, or they become part of a conference proceedings book that's published. Or sometimes it's a straight up submission to a journal, and that's published.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting, so actually initially you get on these discussion lists so that you're already going to get those calls for paper. And what's nice is that each time you have to tweak it a little bit, you are in fact expanding the territory from which you can then do another topic or whatever. And I know as I looked at your resumes, I could see many times for all of you, there would be a conference presentation, and a little bit later, there'd be an article. So I'm wondering how much, Karl, did feedback from the presentation factor into shaping the article?
Yeah, it really depends on the circumstance. There are some conferences where you end up in a very small regional conference where there are 4 or 5 people listening to your paper, and it's more about the discipline of actually getting it written and presenting it. There are other times when the feedback from a conference develops specific opportunities.
Mhm.
And I think, as Bettina mentioned, I was presented on one of O'Connor's novels in a session where we were all presenting on the same novel, and one of the participants said we should try to put a book together. And so that was great because she did all the editorial work, and I just submitted the chapter. So yeah, at that point it grew directly out of the conference. So
Yeah, in fact, many of you have a particular conference or set of conferences that you go to regularly that obviously become a set of people who can speak into your work, to whom you feel responsible when you agree to do a paper, and then you know there are these people expecting this, and that helps keep you motivated. Max, you had, when we talked about connecting to people, and of course you go with students, you made a very interesting comment about how you recommend that your students network horizontally, as opposed to trying to talk to the big, meet the big person that's the sort of the keynote address. And could you explain not only what you mean by network horizontally, but why that's such an important recommendation?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So that was a piece of advice. I wish I could take credit for it, but someone else gave me that advice.
I'll give you credit if you want.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll take it here. But if the mentor happens to watch it, it's theirs, of course. I say the mentor because I don't remember who said that to me. It was someone, but I know it wasn't me. So anyway, you go to a conference and you see famous people. Now, they're not typically famous as in like, we're not talking like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie here. We're talking about people who are, famous in your field, and nobody outside the field knows who these individuals are unless it's a very, very unusual circumstance. But students often want to know them. There's a great example, the conference we go to, the Western Psychological Association. There's a psychologist there who actually is sort of actual famous. His name is Phil Zimbardo. He's the Stanford prison experiment guy.
That experiment.
If you happen to know that one. And he'll literally, stand around and students will come up to him and take pictures with him. He'll sign autographs. It's kind of weird, to be quite frank. But at this point, he's just sort of in that stage of his career. And and so students, they're like, oh, is Zimbardo going to be there? And he'll be there, but you're not going to become his buddy. That's my point. He is not going to give you future career opportunities, but the people who will are your fellow students. So those other people who you meet might be a potential grad cohort member. They might be a potential journal editor in the future, like when you're both well on in your career. And so it really does pay off to make friends and to be nice and to network across rather than that kind of up and down. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really useful thing. And in my own life, that's how I have my opportunities today, is people who I know from grad school, specifically grad school, a couple undergrad folks, but mostly it's people who I met in grad school who were in my same station in life.
Yeah, and so many of you have at certain points done a co-authoring, so I want to come back to that. But Alain, you had a very, unlike sort of everybody else who pretty much moved along the lines of their dissertation, you did, but you found a way of broadening that was really quite unique. So you went and searched out every mention. I can't remember where you went, but you did something to kind of really suss out where the grisette could be found.
Yeah, I use a very systematic method. I decide to read La Bibliographie de France, which is every piece of literature, poem, lithograph that was published week per week. Napoleon Bonaparte Institute that anybody printing anything need to send a copy to the National Library. and everything was written in a book called La Bibliographie de France. So, and all that
France's
has,
bibliography.
exactly, and all that has been put online now because everything has been digitalized. So I've downloaded, it took me months every year.
So everything has been digitalized.
Exactly.
Just in
So
case
I
they
spent
needed
months
translation.
reading and trying to find anything related to grisette. And as I was reaching the year 1827, I noticed for 6 months, the topic number one was a giraffe, the arrival of a giraffe in Paris. And I say, what the heck is that? Why? There was everything, wallpaper, people had hair like a giraffe. And I discovered also that it happened the same time that the King of France, Charles X, censored the press. And there was all kind of adaptation, but it was very political. So when I was writing my dissertation, I said, oh, that's interesting. So I wrote a little cut. I need to come back on that topic, giraffe. And then when I was done with my dissertation, I came to Pointloma. I decided to begin to work on that. And it was fascinating to the point, so I gave a paper on it. And then the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia decided to make a big conference called Of Elephants and Rose about animal in France. And I was invited to give a paper, and my article on the giraffe has been published as a chapter in that book of that research, showing that you couldn't speak about the king, but the giraffe became the king. In fact, you see a lithograph with the king like a giraffe, and it was a way to attack censorship. So one topic, one more time, leading to another one.
Well, it also brings up something else, because oftentimes, I certainly know it happens to me, I'm writing on a topic, and then some fabulous idea sort of streaks through my brain. And I think that's a wonderful idea, but of course I don't have the time to shift my focus and chase that down. So the issue is, what do you do with that idea? And clearly you put it somewhere, put it in a file. Anybody else, the same thing? What happened? Or do you just figure you'll remember it later? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Just a quick response to that. I will sometimes print out the calls for papers that come across the email and discussion groups and just lay them around to torment me, you know, to remind me, oh, I really should submit to that. When is the deadline? Oh yeah, okay. So they're little gremlins to keep me motivated.
Oh, it's the first person I know who needs a physical emblem of guilt. Kara, same thing?
Yeah, well, if I have a good idea, and sometimes hindsight tells me that no, actually those weren't great ideas. So, but I make sure that I write them down. I have a folder on my computer that I do that. And I recently had one that just came to me when I was doing something totally different. I was listening to a podcast, and I thought that would be fascinating to look into. It's a very timely sort of issue. I spent about an hour kind of writing down what made me think of it, looking up a few kind of starter prompts. Of course, I mean, for me, I was like looking up Greek words and trying to see where they hit in the New Testament or the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And then this time, because I'm getting more and more technologically savvy by necessity, I set some alerts to like some, not alerts, but alarms that like, okay, I think I can have the space to think about this in May. And so I set a calendar alert to tell me like, return to this idea in May and see if it's any good. So that's what I did.
Interesting. Yeah. And Karl, do you write? Somebody, I think it was you who said you actually write a little bit so that you kind of know what direction it goes in, or?
Well, I think for me, the time that's happened has been when I encounter a popular culture text, whether a film or a television show or a song or an artist, that I think they're really doing some interesting things here with addressing the American nation in some sense. And yeah, I've got to write those down because I'll forget it. And then I have a chance to kind of come back to that. And there've been some wonderful surprises along the way. Uh, I remember watching the film 28 Days Later, which people miscategorize as a zombie film. And my first response to that was like, it's not a zombie film because there are no zombies in it. And that kind of bugged me that people were talking about this wrong. But then when I actually went back and rewatched the film, there were fascinating elements of Christian community that were addressed in the film. So it started one place and went a completely different direction when I paid closer attention to it.
Interesting. And getting new ideas. I'll tell you, when I looked at Alain's resume and I saw the giraffe, I'm just going, where did that come from? But a great story. And it's certainly the recognition of knowing, of being able to see an opportunity, see an opening, something that will connect to what you do. What's interesting to me also, particularly Kara with you, is that you're writing for radically different audiences. And so you have to be able to take an idea and work with it so that it's gonna go to a very scholarly, knowledgeable audience. And then later on, it's also gonna go to a very unschooled audience. How difficult is it to shift your style and presentation for those audiences? Are there some that are more difficult to write to than others? How does that work?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Back when I was doing, immersed in my doctoral program, the kind of scholarly writing with elaborate footnotes was kind of secondary communication. I was ready and like on alert to impress. And so that seemed more natural. But now, the seas that I swim in are this intersection of like trying to increase academic engagement, try to be very responsible academically, but also translating that to the college student or in my master's classes to pastors who are in the field. And so I really do find that kind of midsection of communication flows much more naturally to me now, which kind of makes sense. But the ideas that I have, they're no less intellectually rigorous, I hope, but the ways in which I communicate them and the things that are persuasive, I find really are shaped by the audience that I'm usually communicating with. So I find where I've seen that play out positively in my writing is writing a commentary. Now, a commentary will have lots of audiences, but it has to be streamlined toward weekly preachers, people who are not experts in this particular book or the practice of academic biblical scholarship, but who also want to communicate well. And so I found a kind of sweet spot. That kind of writing comes much more easily to me. I can trace down technical things, but interpret them back for that audience. But it's for those conference papers that then turn into articles, or writing for like a devotional magazine, like you mentioned, that those really stretch me because I can't assume knowledge at all, or that people are going to do their homework in a devotional magazine. And with my students, I have to, like, they have to do homework for me, And so, yeah, I find those opposite ends of the spectrum more challenging now, but I'm grateful that I've learned that my students have really taught me how to present a complex argument in a compelling way. I mean, that's really been helpful.
Karl,
Hadley,
you want to join that?
Yeah, I was going to say that I know Bettina has had this experience as well with her wonderful scholarship on feminism in the church, to try to connect that to a church audience is a really different experience. I've had the same thing with when I've been asked by my church at times to address Christians in politics or Christians in national identity and so forth. And have had to really think, as Kara said, really think about, okay, how do I take these ideas and make them accessible to people who I think really need to think about this, but are not going to think about it in the way that people reading an academic journal are thinking about it. So I know I've done some of this work with Christian nationalism and trying to critique that in a way that can connect to the people I go to church with. I'm sure Bettina has had that experience with feminist thought as well.
Well, there are ways in which Kara, Karl, Bettina, you are all at moments, you're like salmon, you know, you're going upstream against a current that may not be so receptive to what you have to say. So how do you negotiate that, Bettina?
Well, I've had fewer opportunities to sort of speak publicly to church audiences than you might imagine. But I have been invited on repeated occasions to give lectures at the Osher Institute for Lifelong Learning at UCSD. And it's actually through a church contact I had because of choir. But I think for me, presenting to those folks is a dream because they all want to be there. They're so eager to learn. They see me as such an expert, which is always such a weird thing for me because I don't feel like an expert ever, because there's always more to learn, and I know how much more there is to learn and how little I know of all that much more. But I think I feel it most acutely in writing because I'm writing about intersectionality in the content, but I'm living in the moments of that intersectionality, and it's very vulnerable. In some ways, I feel like writing a straight up academic article about Mary Wollstonecraft and Bram Stoker, Dracula, and the wrongs of women is a lot easier because there's a clinical distance there. I'm writing on an academic subject matter, and that's super safe, you know, as long as I'm doing my work appropriately. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, you can get nasty questions at conferences from listeners who are trying to show that they're the smartest person in the room and you're not. But when I was working on my 2 books with Allison, you know, doing all the editorial work, plus writing chapters, plus writing the introduction, that was a really vulnerable space to be in because I had all these audiences in my mind. I wanted my academic friends who were not in the church to read this and kind of understand that people who are believers are not idiots, right? That we do think too, and we think well. I wanted my fellow, you know, peers in the church, most of whom, you know, if I think about my college friends, are not in positions of academia. So I wanted them to be reading this work. I wanted my sisters to be reading this work. I wanted, you know, people in my current church choir, you know, that my peers there to be reading this work. And I wanted my scholarly peers at Point Loma to be reading this work. And that is really a challenge to write to an audience that is that diverse. And I wanted students to be reading it. And just most recently, this summer, I had a student email me about my book, Being Feminist, Being Christian, how excited she was to have this book. And it was her favorite book, and she had it on her desktop. And then midway through the fall semester, I realized, oh, that's a student I have in one of my classes. You know, and she found the book before she found me. And she was excited about finding me, but it took me a while to find her and connect those dots. So it's fearsome to be writing to that many audiences. It's very vulnerable, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
It's also actually pretty indicative of what it's like to give, oftentimes to do a presentation, particularly if it's not super, super narrow in the group, because to some extent, a good researcher is always at the least bilingual. Speaking a language that experts would recognize, yeah, this is the way we talk about this, and yet at the same time, moving that message, making that message accessible to whatever audience or audiences, plural, might be, you know, there when you're doing that presentation. So I think that's one of the challenges and one of the ways in which doing research and presenting really stretches you. I'd like to move, that we're sort of already kind of getting there, to that process of writing, because there are various things about the process that we all kind of know and share in our different ways. When I started thinking about this, one of the first things that came to my mind was that there are different ways of thinking. And I know when I'm beginning on a project, oftentimes, some of the big shaping the project work I do is done in a much more relaxed state where I'm just letting ideas come and flow. And it's work that I do when I'm taking a shower, and when I'm cooking, and when I'm driving, and when I'm on the exercise bike that goes nowhere, but from one Law and Order rerun to the next. That is when my body is sort of occupied, but my mind is free. So it's not like I'm playing a video game, because then the mind isn't quite so free. But it's when I'm doing things that have me physically occupied, but allow my brain to just kind of let ideas flow. And Max, as if I remember correctly, this is something that you also very much
absolutely.
use.
I think you said it well. I think Hadley, your brain and mine must be very similar, because I do those same activities: cooking, driving. For me, part of my daily routine is running. I kind of run around Point Loma, just sort of in general. I always, students will say, "Hey, didn't I see you on Catalina this morning?" And I say, "Yeah." You're kind of a public figure, as a professor. You can't really hide if you're trying to go exercise. But I find that when I run, a lot of thoughts go through my head. Many of them have to do with work or the social interactions that I've had. And so what I find is that, when you're running, you have to do other things like dodge cars, and, your heart rate starts going up as you go up a hill. And so you have to concentrate on just putting one foot in front of the other. And during those difficult moments, thoughts that don't really matter to me, they just sort of disappear, and they never work their way back. And the things that are important, though, do return to my mind. And so those are the things that I find, I should be thinking more about. So when I go out on my daily run, the thoughts that don't matter seem to disappear. And the ones that are really important to me really kind of provide a foundation for what I should be doing during the day in my work. And so for me, those leisure activities are, believe it or not, they are central. They're the foundation to everything else that I do, not just running, but that just sort of baseline time to do nothing except think about things that I care about.
Yeah, and I have found that so helpful. So oftentimes, if I feel like I just have nothing to say, well, I haven't done enough head work. And so I go back to that space and find that super helpful. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I would say the same thing. I read somewhere that there's an anagogic state between waking and sleeping. And I often find that, for ideas for my poetry that come to me, it's between just about falling asleep and falling asleep. And so sometimes I try to create mnemonics that will help me remember the idea, because I just don't want to get up and write it down and wake up and then try to go to sleep again. Sometimes they come, sometimes definitely in the shower. I mean, what's up with that? But, my brain is always active.
Hot water or something.
Yeah. And I told Hadley, my mind has always been this way. When I was a teenage girl, I distinctly remember having this feeling that I wished at night I could take my head off of my body and set it on my dresser so it could keep thinking all night long and I could sleep. So I think I have a love affair with sleep that I still, do I write, do I sleep? But for sure, these weird spaces where it's not convenient to write things down, great ideas come.
Yes, and Max, you talked
I'm
about
sorry.
both learning and unlearning as happening. Some of the unlearning happens in that time where you maybe weed out weird ideas or.
Yeah, and just like what Bettina was saying, I think rest and sleep are a really important part of that process. So, when we sleep, we actually know this, cognitively. When we sleep, stuff that we don't need is essentially deleted. Connections in our brain are pruned, and so I think that happens during many restful activities as well. You just really kind of naturally prioritize what's important to you and learn what's not as well. So
Which makes a lot of sense, although I have to say this is the first time I've heard a very scholarly defense of sleeping on the job.
No, I think we should be paid for it. I think that is, that's basically work. It's our most important work.
Kara?
I was just going to add that I've noticed that I mentioned before getting ideas from podcasts and whatever, as much kind of cross-disciplinary kind of curiosity and wonder that I have about the world that I think podcasts and audiobooks can foster. They also have the potential for me of filling every blank space. And so I think that I have less of that quiet shower time. I have a news podcast blaring at me while I'm showering. I have music in my ears when I'm working out, and that sort of, I mean, it has to be loud enough to drown out my breathing. And so I think it gets rid of my thoughts too.
Are you missing that time?
Yeah, I think I'm missing that. I think that's part of when you feel a sort of dryness in scholarly ideas or new connections. I think I'm partially the cause because of how I'm choosing to use that kind of, or to abuse that mental downtime.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay, then the issue is, okay, so you have an idea. You've requested doing a paper, you've submitted an idea to somebody as a chapter for somebody's book, and you've got this thing that you're going to be working on. How, in the midst of incredibly busy lives and a schedule that offers very little free time, how do you keep yourself motivated? How do you keep yourself motivated? Anna, what would you say?
Well, I guess it depends from one person to another one, but I'm a little bit OCD, and when I do something, I'm just immerse myself completely, and I'm very passionate in what I do. So when there's something that really interests me, or I do it. Of course, it's very hard during the semester to do a lot of work, and most of my work is done during the summer because we have to teach those classes, all those assignments to correct, and that certainly limits what we can do. But we have those. I work very well with. The conference coming in 2 weeks. I need to write that paper. So that's a stimulation. So having to do something, like for the students also, right? Stimulate me to work on something, right?
Absolutely, having a deadline.
Everything deadline, yeah.
How about you, Bettina? What is your attitude towards, how do you use conferences, for example, as a way to keep yourself working?
In the ways that Alain just mentioned, printing out those papers, and there's a deadline for submission, there's a deadline to have it written, there's a deadline to get to the conference and present it. Deadlines are important for certain. Doing that during the school year, the conference paper is probably what's been manageable for me. The books that Ali and I have worked on are much bigger projects.
But doesn't she help you keep?
Well, they have required that we carve out time to get together physically and work in ways that are not possible really during a full-on semester.
Right.
with one article that we weren't doing for our own book, but we were submitting to another book, a weekend was enough. We got together and we read, researched, and wrote the article together in a weekend, long weekend. But the books took much more time than that. And it had to be sustained over weeks. And particularly with the first one, you know, my family felt like, my boys were little at the time, oh, we have our mother back. Because literally I would just go to the office and work all day without interruptions to get all of those pieces in order. But we were working to a deadline there too. So
and didn't you make
important.
yourself a promise about conferences?
I did. When I wrote my first conference paper, my now 27-year-old son was on my lap in my third floor apartment while I was still working on my dissertation. And I said at that time, when I get a job, when I get out, finish my dissertation and get a job, I want to do one conference paper a year. And I'm never going to a conference unless I'm presenting at the conference. And I've been pretty close to keeping that. I mean, I have gone to a few conferences where I haven't presented, but most of them are conferences where I'm presenting.
Yeah, I'm overwhelmed by that. And Kara, you have something you do, a paper log, or what is that?
Yeah, especially when I was making progress on a bigger project. So this was a book length project. For me, it's so daunting to see like the word count or the character count or the number of pages that I have to come up with. And it feels like, why am I even investing? You know, all I have is half an hour between when my class is over and when I have to pick up my daughter from the daycare or something like that. There's always something like that. And part of what I needed to do was see it on paper. So I just had this simple paper where I wrote what day it was, how much time I invested, just very generically, what topic was I working on at that point, and how many words I got out in that time. And so I would have just like my starting word count, my ending word count. And it didn't take long to see how those little times actually added up to something substantial. And that in and of itself was sort of like the motivation to keep going, to say like, oh, I'm actually making progress. And that end is not so distant. I mean, it was still distant, but you could imagine then that how these things snowball. And I've seen the greatest progress when I just take a tiny moment to document what I've actually accomplished.
Yeah, Kara made an excellent point there. I'm going every year to Comic-Con, and I used to go to listen to the author where they speak about and everybody saying, how can you write so many pages? And they say, there's no secret. I have a family. I put my clock at 5 a.m. I work from 5 to 7. Then I take care of my kids. I just give them breakfast, put them at school, and when I'm back, so they have this time that they have things. Even I don't wait for the muse to come to inspire me. I'm on a schedule, and that helped a lot. Yes.
When I took over as running faculty development, the Center for Teaching and Learning, running the LEAP program, teaching in it, doing senior honors, and Dean of General Ed. So I was busy. But I also felt if I'm heading up faculty development, I have to be continuing to do research. That's just a necessity, because that's just, otherwise I don't have any sense of personal integrity leading, running faculty development. So what I decided, I will work 15 minutes every day on whatever it is I was researching, and often the 15 turned into 30 or 45. But even if it didn't, it was 15 minutes. You don't get a lot done in 15 minutes. But what you do, I discovered, is you keep that research on the front burner. So that when I was taking a shower, when I was cooking and trying not to burn the rice, when I was which I didn't always succeed in, which is why I tell people I have a black belt in cooking because of how much I've burned. But nonetheless, when I was doing those activities, because that research was on the front burner, I could get some things sorted out. And when a 2-hour or a 3-hour block of time opened up, I didn't have to waste it or half of it by remembering where I was. So that was an incredibly important thing, writing every day, always keeping those ideas right in the forefront of my mind. But Max, you have a very interesting perspective on writing and how much you throw yourself into this. And it connects to the idea of keeping balance that you tell your students about. So what is that you kind of work on?
Yeah, I think similar to what everyone has said so far, I think routine and balance are just so central to what we do. So if you try to do it all in one day, whether it's a presentation or a major project or whatever, or try to do it all even in just a week, you run the risk of really getting burned out very quickly. So it's really important to have social support. It's really important to have that work-life balance. But I think similar to what everybody is saying, just those little gains every day really add up over the long term. So I saw a movie once, I can't remember the name of it, where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, if you know The Rock, here I am quoting The Rock in an academic, talk. But in the movie, he played a sort of a nerd who had morphed into The Rock later in life. And somebody asked him, like, how did you do it? And he said, anybody could do it. All I did, I worked out 2 hours a day, every day for 20 years. And that is so true for what we do. Maybe you all are special people. I am not a special person. I'm not, but I'm a really hard worker. And I also know how to manage myself. So I'm not going to work, 18 hours a day on a project, but I might work 2, and I might do it every day for a year. Mm-hmm. And so I think that truly is a very, very effective way to get work done, and also to be able to sustain it. And that's the key in academia. Academia is the long game. You have to be able to sustain the work, or it's just not gonna happen for you.
Yeah. And don't people figure into helping sometimes? They may not do the work. I mean, sometimes they do. It's a co-author, and you're together on this long weekend and you're sorting out and creating this article. Yeah, so sometimes people are directly involved. But even when they aren't, Kara, don't you find that there are people who support what you're doing in some pretty important ways?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I need to thank children's teachers and childcare providers as much as any academic help that I've received. I am grateful, and I think we need to normalize the idea that there is paid help and that there is also a kind of balance. I hired a friend's 12-year-old son. I wouldn't have had him babysit my children by himself, but I was in the house. I just needed them to have somebody to play with. And so he came over and played with them while I was finishing up a bibliography that I had to get done. Oh no, it was an index. Sorry, even more boring than a bibliography. I know, it was nightmarish. And then also I cannot advocate enough for a supportive spouse who believes in equality of shared labor in the home. And then also my parents have been really generous. Like if I'm ever at one of those big deadlines where I'm not maintaining a work-life balance like Max is talking about, where I'm like, this thing has to get done, I've been grateful to have either my mother-in-law or my parents who don't live nearby, but who are willing to come and help. I mean, I couldn't do it without sometimes those interventions. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, I had, when I was during the year, the big year of project development with Houghton Mifflin on the textbook that I published. I have a friend Actually, my daughter's best friends were twins, and their mother and I became friends. And the mother had a PhD in anthropology, but taught part-time at both state in both women's studies and in anthro. Because when she had the twins, not her first child, she just thought, no, I'm going to be a full-time mom, and I'm not going to pursue a full-time career. And every Tuesday, my daughter went home with her girls. They did homework together. They went to Aikido. They had dinner together. They played. And when it was time for bed, my friend drove my daughter home. And Friday was the same thing. She gave me 2 days a week where I could just devote time to working on this project. And she said, this is my book too. I'm never going to write a book. This is also my book. And I've had the chance to pay that forward a couple of times. But it was an incredible gift. And I know, Bettina, your husband has been very helpful. What I loved, Karl, however, was your story about how your need to really work meshed very nicely with your the work of your spouse, who is also an academic in music.
Yeah, we don't have the issues of childcare and trying to carve out that kind of space, but it's always when she's in a good practice routine and is spending 2 or 3 hours at the piano every day, it's pretty good time to be writing.
Because Karl works well to music.
Yeah.
This would not work for me.
It's a good thing I work well to music, or I wouldn't get any work done at all.
Exactly. Oh, shoot. Okay. So I think of writing as basically writing is just thought made visible and permanent, so that in fact others can interact with it, and you can sometimes interact with it yourself, look and think, is that what I really thought back then? So you're writing because you have some thoughts that you want to put down on paper and share. But don't you sometimes also find that when you're writing, you discover that you think some things you didn't realize you did think? And, what does that sort of lead to? Kara, you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick on this. Absolutely. I find it really unmotivating to know the answer to all of the problems that are going to be presented by a text when I begin, because then I'm like, well, it must have been so obvious that I don't really need to wrestle with this. So I have often discovered things in the process of research and writing simply by it's not simple, but by really pausing and thinking to myself, what one of my professors in my grad work said. I had somehow skated by just being able to be a kind of interesting writer and hadn't realized how much I needed to bring somebody along with my thought process. And by doing that, by having to explain, okay, here's exactly how I think this is working, how these phrases are working together, something, by having to lay that out, I get to deeper, and sometimes it would seem kind of meticulous or maybe small things, but that cumulatively taught me like, oh, actually there's even more proof of my case going on here, simply because I had to bring somebody through things that I had just assumed were so obvious in my writing. And so that that kind of chastisement that I got, that I thought was embarrassing, like, hey, we're not inside your head, explain this to me, which I was scribbled in some scrawl on a paper, turned out to be a practice that helps me know what I'm thinking more and be able to make more convincing arguments. Yeah.
Yeah, Bettina, you use the phrase writing uncovers.
Oh, I definitely think Karl and I, and maybe some of the others as well, have an advantage because we teach writing as well as do the work of writing. and they definitely mutually inform one another. But I always have some kind of a plan in place before I start writing, but I know that that plan is going to change. So I write my way toward knowing what it is that I think, that I know, that's underneath all of the sort of surface thoughts. And it doesn't mean that I abandon all of the surface thoughts, but I have to be engaged in writing for all those puzzle pieces to really sift and sort themselves into place. And when I teach writing, I try to alleviate the stress of my students by telling them that that's a completely normal process. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your process if you have to change things as you go along. In fact, that is a mark of really being engaged in the process. And I've talked with Greg Crow about this and the difference between mathematicians and those of us who work in the humanities. The mathematicians know their proofs before they ever start writing, and they just explain that. Whereas we write to what we know, and we uncover it and discover it in the process.
Yeah, Alain, do you have that same experience, or? You have to.
I was
yes,
yes,
there you are.
That's better. I love to travel, and there's different way you can travel. I've been all around the world, and usually I open a book, I say, oh, I like to go there. And then when you arrive there, it's full of tourists, it's completely fake, but you discover there's a little village with a lot of interesting things going on. That's part of the process, that you think you're going to go there, and as you're going there, you discover more things. So being engaged in doing something, of course, is going to lead you to a different place. In addition to that, also discussing with other people, of course, may open door or close door. I remember being in disagreement with my thesis director because I suddenly realized I knew more on the topic that she knew, and she wanted me to do something. I said, no, that's absolutely not where that text goes, here and there. So, and my other professor said, feel your guts, because we know that you're going in the right direction. Don't care about your thesis director. That was a specific case. I'm not saying that you should not do what your thesis director does, but that might happen also.
Interesting. So when I talk with students, or when I used to, since I'm retired now, well, when I used to talk with them about writing, I would tell them that writing was like building a desert island. Building a house on a desert island. You needed 5 workers and you needed a set of rules. And the workers would be an inventory clerk. They go out and they search out what's on the island. Where's the data? Where's the raw material I can use? And then you have a madman who takes all that and figures out various ways that could be combined, some of which are ridiculous and some of which aren't, and so on. Then you have an architect who sorts through that and comes up with a reasonable plan. Then you have the carpenter who executes that plan. And finally, you have a judge who comes and decides what does and doesn't work. And the rules are those workers have to come in that order. And I realized that when I sat down and felt like I had writer's block, it just meant the carpenter had sat down before any of the other people had done their work. And I knew where I needed to go to maybe get this process moving along. So in that order, only one person on the work site at a time, which was challenging. And then finally, anybody can call back a previous worker for more. You know, the carpenter can be working, I need more of such and send the inventory clerk out to find a little more data on that issue. So, but as I myself, it helped me a lot over what I thought was writer's block, and it wasn't, it was just not being prepared. But I also began to recognize that I had 2 workers who were pretty much out of control. The judge was leaping onto the work site way too early and bossing everybody around and being absolutely obnoxious. And the inventory clerk never wanted to leave, was always going, wait a minute, there's something else you could be reading. Wait a minute, you could be adding this to it. You should be. So I'm very curious, who among those workers is out of control for you? So, Kara, I see your head nodding.
I think we need to talk to the inventory clerk union and the judges kind of bar, because there is obviously a problem in these fields, because yes,
Yeah.
they are, especially, I mean, so I have a discipline on which things have been written for nearly 2,000 years now. And so there is literally no end to the amount of inventory that I could call on any given occasion. And so at some point that inventory clerk, so to speak, has to take their lunch break. I mean, they can't keep gathering. And yeah, the judge is like my worst professors, worst critics that just kind of hop in and critique me at any point. And so, yes, is everybody the same? I feel like that everybody has to be the same on this. I don't know. I'm so interested.
Alain, are you in the same space?
I'm a clerk. I love to collect information. And when I was doing my dissertation research, there's one moment when my professor, you need to write a chapter, say, but yes, but I still need to read that book. And, but I find that, and they say, stop, Alain, stop your research now and begin to write. And that was a big lesson for me, because I always thought that there was I cannot try, I haven't covered everything. So to know when to stop your research and begin, and you have enough to write, it's a very important stage of that.
It is indeed. Not easy to get to.
Yeah, we had one professor which was not in my committee, which was more the judge person every time. And she worked with two students who completely abandoned their thesis because what they had written they were not encouraged, because they had only this judgment, and it's really sad for them that they never finished because they had not the encouragement to continue also. Yeah.
For you, Bettina?
Oh, I totally relate, Hadley, to what you and Kara were saying, that constant anxiety that I don't know enough, I haven't read enough, someone's going to poke holes in this. And then the judge saying, oh, this is so obvious, you're not saying anything new, everyone's thought this already, it's completely a waste of time for you to be saying this. And it's not like one is talking only, they're all talking at the same time all the time.
Chaos.
Yeah.
Mental chaos.
I think Hadley, we joked that when I first did that Strengths Quest thing, I think I recognize these aspects of my personality. I just don't call them strengths all the time because that context thing, I've just got to still to stop. It's just can't, And I think for me, the most interesting story is when I was working on a paper on Black Panther, on the film and the comic books, because I saw the film, had this immediate idea for a paper, found a group that was putting a book together, knew this was a place that I could publish this work, but also only had like 15 pages. And so when I dove into my subscription to Marvel Unlimited, which was a dangerous thing because it gave me access to every comic book they've ever published, and started reading all these backstories of the Black Panther character, convinced that, and it was affirming what I had thought, that this was participating in a Black discourse that goes back to the 1920s and earlier. And it got to a point where I had plenty of examples and information to write the paper, but had all these other,
that I had yet to read.
Storylines that I could keep reading. And I remember just having to tell myself over one Christmas break, it's like, no, you're done. These other stories are great, and maybe you'll get back to them sometime, but you've got plenty to make to build the argument that you want to build, and you have to stop gathering information.
Yeah. And this issue of having to control or ignore part of what's going on in your head in order to continue working gets me to the issue of the voice, which of course everybody has the voice, and students often think they're the only one who hears the voice. And in fact, Dean had wanted to open this up to some student questions and Ashley hadn't quite had enough time to get that fully together, but one student did manage to bring out a question that she had, and it dealt with the voice, because she has the voice, which I've decided to promote actually to the level of disease that I might call vocus interruptus, because of course that's exactly what that voice does. It interrupts your process. And so do you experience the voice, and how do you, well, Bettina, you've already kind of talked to it, it's going that judge, this is silly, you're not gonna, no one's gonna wanna hear this. Karl, do you hear that voice? What do you do with that voice?
Yeah, oftentimes the voice is a stylistic voice for me. That I look back at something I've written and think, that's a terrible sentence. First of all, that's just badly constructed sentence. How in the world could you think that you can write this paper if you can't write a better sentence than that? And that just like, okay, get a draft down and then decide whether or not the sentences are good and the paragraphs are good. But let's not think around about the exact word choice in this sentence, in this draft. There's plenty of time for that later.
Right, that's the judge and the carpenter trying to work together, which doesn't always work. Kara, you talked also about actually having two voices.
Yeah, I'm worried that Max is going to diagnose me now, though, but here we go. Yeah, I have that critical voice. I'm thinking of the professors who have said the most kind of cutting things about my work, or that when people are like, I don't know what you're saying here, and I look back and I'm like, I have no idea what I was saying, oh dear. So I've got that voice going on, but I also have this, and really this could be a personality disorder, this self-aggrandizement voice that's like, oh my goodness, are we revolutionizing the face of New Testament scholarship right now with what we're writing? Like everybody's going to want to read this. And that's a false voice as well. And recognizing both of them for the liars and the getting in my way of actually making a claim is really important.
Yeah, Max, do you recognize any of that?
Yeah, I totally, not in you, Kara, but I resonate with that, because I have two voices as well. One of them is the one that's telling me that all my work is amazing. It's this overly aggrandizing, very overconfident voice that I have, I totally recognize that in myself. It's ridiculous how confident I am, in my own ability. But that the other voice, the one that I think that I think gets me into the most trouble, because I can calm myself down about my own confidence. But the one that gets me into the most trouble is the one that always tells me to do more and more and more work, always taking on more tasks, more responsibilities. And what I found, I shared this with Hadley earlier, academia is like a pie eating contest. The more work that you take on, the more that comes your way. The more pie that you eat, the more they give you. And the prize in this pie eating contest is more pie. There's just more pie. That's all it is. And so you have to, it always goes back to, telling that voice that you have done enough today, or you have done enough this week or this year or whatever it might be. And also, I think confidence and overconfidence and underconfidence is a really important issue. So I don't want to minimize that at all. But I think we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble by taking on too many tasks. And for me, I'm always pushing myself to just do more and more and more. And sometimes you have to put your fork down and push that pie away.
Yeah, the issue of the overconfidence, I thought was, I mean, obviously, the voice that tells you this is silly and that wants, motivates you then to quit. You need to be able to tell that voice to just shut up, and you need to learn the voice lies regularly. The voice lies. And as Kara already pointed out, sometimes the things you just take for granted are in fact things that other people need explained to them. And that's one of the wonderful processes that you uncover as you're doing this kind of work. But the self-confident voice sets you up for disappointment, because when the world doesn't fall over in amazement and the paper doesn't get accepted by the journal and so on. So how do you deal with those failures without letting them unravel you?
Yeah, just to jump back in really quickly here. I want to say to those people too who feel underconfident, who have sort of that opposite voice. My most brilliant students who I have had as a professor are by far the most underconfident students I have had.
Absolutely.
So they are so bright and so amazing, and they have no idea. They just don't have the confidence. And even when I tell them, you were incredible, they say, oh, you're just being nice. You're just a nice person.
Max,
So,
I think Bettina spoke to it, because Bettina said the more she knew or knows on a topic, the more she recognizes she has still more to learn. And so when our really good students develop what it is, they also have a sense of how much more there is. And that fuels that underconfidence. And no, I couldn't do graduate work. No, I couldn't do this. And
well, I really appreciate Max stepping in and speaking to the underconfident voice, because in all honesty, I cannot relate to any of you who have an overconfident voice. I don't even know what that would feel like. And I think a lot of beginning writers and student writers will probably feel no confidence at all. Though I have observed in almost 40 years of teaching some astonishing overconfidence from novice writers. But I think Kara was right. You really do have to slog on in sheer dogged determination in ignoring those two voices.
Yep.
And just, I find myself saying, well, that may be true. This may be really obvious and no one may be interested, but I have to do this work anyway. I have to write this anyway. I have to stay the course. I have to meet the deadline. I have to be faithful to the work that's in front of me. And if something wonderful comes from it, hallelujah. And if something wonderful doesn't come from it, well, I've been faithful.
okay, we have just 2 minutes left. And so I am hoping that each of you could say one very brief thing that you would give as your single word of advice to the fledgling and future writers who will be listening to this. And you may not think yourself a writer, but if you have thoughts, you're a potential writer. So what would be your word of advice, Karl, to a fledgling writer?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to start with me. I think just follow what you're interested in, and keep focusing on that. Because if you're trying to push through something to write about something you don't care about, at a certain point, that's just going to give out.
Okay, Kara.
I feel like we talked about this before, and I don't know what I said then, but what I would say is your authentic voice is a gift to the world, and maybe that's the overconfidence, but pretending to be someone else, pretending to know an experience that's not yours, really deprives yourself and others. So be who you actually are and pursue it.
Okay, Max.
Yeah, try new things and don't be afraid if they don't go well. That's okay. That's part of the process. That happens to everybody. I can't tell you how many journals I've been rejected from, how many grad schools I've been rejected from. And that's part of the process. So try new things, be yourself, and it will work out, but it takes time.
Okay, Alain? Alain, give yourself the mic.
Sorry.
There you go.
I will say be persistent. There's always light after the tunnel, and be passionate in what you do.
Yes,
And then you'll be fulfilled by that.
good. And Bettina?
I think I already said mine, but I would say just stay true to your commitments, and life will yield rich results.
Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit, turned down by every single publisher. Every one. She self-published. There you go. So find a passion and go with it and believe in yourself. Okay, thank you so much for your time, and particularly in the day of COVID when your faculty, your teaching time has doubled and tripled. This was a real gift of time, and I want you to know I very much appreciate the honor of being able to talk to you about this. So thanks.
Just a little heads up about next year's Writer Symposium 2022. David Brooks from the New York Times, Cornell West from Harvard University, Nadia Boltz-Weber from Denver, Colorado. They'll all be here. They'll be in person. I hope to see you there. Go online, pointloma.edu/writers for more information.